Hello there. Today we'll be reading the prologue to Fred Anderson's Crucible of War. It's a very important book. It's a great insight to the French and Indian War and easy to understand. So, today we'll be doing exactly as I said we will. We'll be reading the prologue. Jumonville's Glen, May 28th, 1754. The rain had fallen all night, a steady, miserable rain. When at last the light grew to the point that he could see his troops, George Washington realized that 7 of them were lost in the forest, God knew where. For hours he had blundered through the dripping dark, time and again, leading the little column off the trail, sometimes taking a quarter hour just to grope his way back to the track. Confused, untrained, and wretched, the 40 soldiers who had somehow held together through the night were hardly prepared to fight any enemy, let alone one experienced in forest warfare. Nonetheless, the tall Virginian led them on, along the Indian warrior who had come to warn them of their peril. Toward daybreak, the rain stopped, and the remnants of George Washington's patrol reached the Indian camp. There, the soldiers dried and loaded their muskets, while Washington conferred with the old chief who had summoned him. Tanaga Hirson, called the Half King by the English, who regarded them as an ally, described the tracks he had seen nearby. They led toward a sheltered place, he knew. There, he suspected the French had been bivouacked since the day before. Washington's soldiers could march to a spot nearby and wait while his own men reconnoitered. Once the warriors knew the enemy's strength and disposition, they and the Virginians could fall on the camp together. Washington agreed. He had no choice. However little he cared for Indians, however little he trusted them, he never had found the Frenchmen's camp without them. Surely he could not have found it in time to dispose his men in firing positions while the French, groggy with sleep, were just starting to cook breakfast at the foot of a tall rock face. Quietly his men and the Indians stationed themselves above and around the narrow glen, while on its floor Frenchmen still crawled from their bark-lean toes and stretched themselves in early light. As always in such affairs, no one knows exactly what happened next. Perhaps, as the French later said, the English fired on them without warning. Or perhaps, as Washington maintained, a Frenchman shouted a warning that sent his comrades flying to their arms and firing up onto the woods. All that is certain is the English fired 2 volleys down into the hollow while the French returned a few ragged shots and tried to retreat into the shelter of the trees. But there was no escape. The Half-King's warriors had blocked the path, forcing the 30-odd Frenchmen back into the clearing, where English fire pinned them down. The officer called for quarter, Washington ordered his men to cease firing. Perhaps 10 minutes had passed since the first shot. It had been a lopsided skirmish. Around the rim of the hollow, 3 of Washington's troops were wounded, and 1 lay dead. At its bottom, the French had suffered 14 casualties. One of the wounded, a 35-year-old ensign named Joseph Colin de Villiers de Jumonville, identified himself as the detachment's commander. Through a translator, he tried to make it known that he had come in peace, as an emissary with a message summoning the English to withdraw from the possessions of His Most Christian Majesty Louis XV. The letter he carried would make everything clear. His interpreter would read it. As the combatants' adrenaline levels subsided and the wounded men moaned, the translation went badly. The letter had to be read a second time, and Washington returned to take it back to his own translator. As he withdrew, Tanaga Hirson stepped up to where Jumonville lay. "Tu n'es pas encore mort, mon père," he said. "Thou art not yet dead, my father." He raised his hatchet and sank it into the ensign's head, striking it until he had shattered the cranium. Then he reached inside the skull, pulled out a handful of viscous tissue, washed his face, his hands, and Jumonville's brain. The tall Virginian, who until that instant thought himself at command, did nothing while the Half-King's warriors, as if on a signal, set about killing the wounded. Within moments, only one of the Frenchmen who had been hit in the firefight was left alive. Recovering his composure, Washington now salvaged what he could by forming his men around the 21 surviving prisoners and hustling them to safety. Behind them, in a bloody hollow, the Half-King's men scalped and stripped 13 corpses, decapitating one and impaling his head on a stake. Then they too abandoned the Glen, and crows flapped noisily down from trees to begin the feast. Soon wolves would lope in to do their part. Eventually even maggots, and beetles, and ants finished the job in a meticulous silence. By afternoon, Washington was back at his camp, groping for explanations and trying to plan his next move. Since boyhood, he had dreamed of battle's glory. Now he had seen combat, but no heroism. Only chaos and slaughter of defenseless men. Why had it happened? What could he tell his superiors? What would happen next? George Washington had none of those answers. There could hardly be a clear example of a historical moment when events vastly incommensurate with human intention begin to follow from the efforts of an individual to cope with a situation run out of control than this otherwise ordinary Wednesday morning in May 1754. Nothing could have been further from Washington's mind or more alien to the designs of men who had entrusted him with troops and ordered him to the Ohio Valley than beginning a war. Neither he nor his masters imagined that they were setting a train event that would destroy the American Empire of France. Much less could they have foreseen that a stunning Anglo-American victory would lead to yet another war, one that would destroy Britain's empire and raise in its ruin the American Republic that Washington himself would lead. So extraordinary indeed were the events that followed from this callow officer's act and hesitation that we must begin by shaking off the impression that some awesome destiny shaped the occurrences in the Ohio Valley during the 1750s. For in fact, the presence of French troops and forts in the region, the determination of Virginia's colonial governor to remove them, and the decisions of the French and British governments to use military force to back up the maneuverings of colonists to deepen the American interior, all resulted from the unusually powerful coincidence of some very ordinary human factors: ambition and avarice, fear and misunderstanding, miscalculation and mischance. How such a combination could produce a backwoods massacre is not perhaps hard to imagine. How that particular butchery gave rise to the greatest war of the 18th century, however, is less easy to explain. To understand it, we must first chart the paths by which the interests of the Iroquois Confederacy, the government of New France, the governor of Virginia, and a group of Anglo-American land speculators all converged in the spring of 1754, at the spot where the Allegheny joins the Monongahela, and the Ohio waters begin their long descent through the heart of America to the Mississippi Sea. Well, we finished the prologue. I will see you next time, where we will read the next chapter of this epic tale, the Crucible War. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.